Hi and welcome back to Dizzy So and So. I'm Dave Dawson and today's project is going to be a pinny, which was asked for by one of our Facebook followers, Georgina. So Georgie, if you're watching, take good note. I might pop this in the post to you, you never know. Okay, so what do we need for our project? Today we need some cotton for the waistband. I've sewn two together already. But you need quite a lengthy piece unless you're really skinny. The fabric was only on a metre wide, so I've stuck a couple together. We probably won't need all that, but we'll start with that and see how we get on. We then need bias binding or bias tape. We need the lining fabric with a piece of wadding, just a 2 ounce wadding. You don't need anything special for that, just a bog standard wadding for the filling, and then your main fabric, and they all need to be cut out exactly the same size. It doesn't matter what size. If you want to get a tape measure and measure from hip bone to hip bone so the pinny sits nicely there, that's an excellent idea, but it really doesn't matter. If you like it to go around a little bit further, or you like it shorter, you just want a couple of pockets in the front, that's fine. It's down to you how wide you want it, but make sure you've got enough length from top to bottom so you can fold it over and create two decent sized pockets. If you're going to use it in a garden, you're going to want to make it sort of trowel sort of length, and if you're using it in the kitchen, just from wrist to finger sort of length, whichever suits you really. It's your own personal choice there. So this is really flexible, make it for exactly what you want it to be. Okay, so let's crack on. So once you've laid up your fabric with the lining, the wadding and your outer fabric, pin them together at the top edge. This is going to be the top of your pocket, which we're going to put a bit of bias binding on to edge it off nicely, and then we're going to sew it all together. Give yourself a 2 centimetre seam allowance on this one, because we're going to trim it off, and I want to make sure we've got everything caught inside this wadding. You don't want it sort of slipping down once the garment is made, because it will just end up all bunched up at the bottom of the pocket. So you want to trap it and catch it nicely. Okay, repeat that step for the bottom edge. So I've just turned it around and we're going to do the same again. A 2 centimetre seam allowance. So we've pinned on our bias binding and we're going to sew all the way along this crease. So we've sewed the top and bottom edges to hold everything together, and now on the top edge I'm just going to trim away the seam allowance to about 5mm to the seam, just to reduce the bulk, so when we're putting on the bias binding that doesn't present us with any issues. There we go, and our next step from here is to take your bias binding, place it along the top edge, get yourself a tiny overlap on that edge, and pin it in place. We've sewn all the way along this crease to put on our bias binding, and then we're going to fold it over to the other side, and we're also going to fold over the edge of the bias binding, and then we're going to pin it in place. Do that all the way along, and then we're going to stitch in the ditch to catch the back side. But before I do that, I'm going to give it a press. So the bias binding is folded over now, it's all pinned in place, and now we're going to stitch in the ditch all the way along to catch that back edge. But remember, if you can see the stitch on the back side, i.e. the tape is not covering it, you're not going to catch it. So make sure you've pinned it in place correctly. Okay, so now we've bound the top of our pocket with bias binding. We're going to fold it up and then measure both ends so they come up the same amount, otherwise we'll have a wonky pocket. Nobody likes a wonky pocket. And then just pin the edges together, just straight, we're not folding it over or anything like that. And once you've done that, we'll just sew a 2 cm seam allowance along there. So I've pinned my fabric together and I'm ready to sew. I'm lined up with a 2 cm seam allowance mark. And as always, start off with a back stitch, just to lock it in. And of course finish with a back stitch as well. Okay, repeat that for the other side. Okay, so our next step is to measure from our seam line there, what we've just done, to the opposite seam line and halve it. Now mine is just over 18, so I'm going to make mine 9 1/8, and then I'm going to just place a pin where I want to start my sewing, just to mark it. Try not to drop the tape on the floor, and do the same again. This is where you need 3 hands. Okay, now this is probably easier if you put it on a flat surface. Get your ruler out and use a bit of tailor's chalk. But because it's the top side of the garment, go really easy on the chalk, otherwise you're going to have to wash it off, which is not a problem. But if you can do it without using the chalk, that's no problem. Just makes life that little bit easier. So now I've marked my sewing line. There we go. So there's our pocket in place. I'll trim all the threads in a moment. So we've got 2 pockets, and the next step is to trim down the sides with our scissors to reduce that seam allowance to about 5 mm, so we can repeat this step along the sides. Do be careful when you do that though, as you've got twice as much bulk to deal with, so take your time and get it right. I'll leave you to do that step on your own. I've shown you once, you'll be fine. I've just zoomed in to show you how we're going to finish this bottom corner. It's exactly the same technique, except we fold it at the bottom so that when we turn it over we get a nice sharp edge. And remember, you can either trim this with scissors or you can just fold it in at 45 degrees before you fold over, and then you won't see anything protruding on the outside. And then everything else is just the same. So as you can see, we've bound the edges of our pinning. We formed our 2 pockets by doing the centre seam, and now it's time to work on the waistband. Now before we can do anything with the waistband, firstly we need to line it up in the middle, which is easy for me because I've joined 2 1 metre lengths together. But we need to do a fair bit of pressing before we can get on, because we want to press a centre fold all the way along, and we also need to turn and press a seam allowance. So we're basically making a big version of our bias binding. So we're going to fold in that little bit, I'm going to fold in this little bit, and then we're going to fold it all over like that, all the way along, and that will then be our waistband. But let's do some ironing and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so we pressed open our waistband and we found the centre. If you haven't joined your 2 pieces, just fold it in half, nice and simple. Find the centre, give it a quick mark, and then we're going to pin it. And we're going to pin it to where we sewed across the top. So that seam line all the way along the top, we are going to pin this crease line that we've made in our waistband there. So when we stitch it on, it will hide that those stitches, we don't want to see them. Because we've got such a nice wide piece of material for our waistband, you can probably afford to just come this side of the stitching to make sure we don't miss any when we sew it on. So, okay, so I've sewn along that top crease line and we're ready now. Need to, in fact, let's turn it over, fold it up and over, and then that will hide all the stitching on the back. Just a couple of pins to hold it in place. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start at the corner of our waistband, and we're going to top stitch just at the width of the sewing foot away from the edge, just to make it easy to line up and follow with your sewing machine. And we're going to sew all the way along, and then when we get to here, we're just going to continue going till we get to the other corner of that waistband, and that will put a nice strength to our waistband where it attaches to the pocket. And if there are any heavy loads, there should be enough strength in it to deal with that admirably. So let's get cracking on that. There you can see the nice neat top stitching all the way along, and that follows all the way along the waistband, closing it off. And there you are, project finished. Well, here's our completed project. The pinny looks great. 2 good sized pockets there, and it's hiding my stomach. Do you think it suits me? What a brilliant little project. Thank you, Georgie, for your idea there. I hope you like it, and I hope your one comes out just as well. Don't forget to press the subscribe button, and if you've got any ideas of your own that you want to put forward, put them on the Facebook page and we'll see what we can come up with.